At dawn on Christmas Day, 1852, a magistrate was forced to break down the door of the most secure bedroom in Mississippi. Inside, he found a scene that science can't explain to this day. On the floor lay Colonel Amos Drayton, a healthy tycoon of immense power, dead without a single scratch, bruise, or drop of blood. Sitting just 3 feet away was a young woman in a pristine white dress, untouched, watching his body cool with a sinister calm. The room was locked from the inside. The windows were sealed. There was no weapon, but the police report uncovered a document that turned this from a death scene into a macabre mystery. It was a bill of sale signed 6 months earlier, containing a clause never seen before or since in the history of the slave trade. The buyer assumes all liability. Warning, to touch her is to die. The colonel had laughed at the contract. Now he was the first victim of a hidden mechanism that killed without touching. Was it a voodoo curse from the deep delta, a sophisticated biological trap, or the most patient act of revenge ever recorded? Today, we open the case file on the cruelest purchase ever made, and the woman who became the angel of death. Before we reveal what the coroner found in that locked room, I need you to join this investigation. Click the subscribe button for Before the Story right now. We don't just tell history, we exhume the dark secrets that others try to bury. If you believe justice can sometimes look like magic, hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this mystery unfold tonight? Now let's go back to the auction block where the countdown began. The narrative begins not in the humidity of the Delta, but in the refined, suffocating atmosphere of the Exchange Hotel in Richmond, Virginia, on June 14th, 1852. The auction catalogue from that day, preserved in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, lists typical transactions for the era: livestock, land deeds, and human labor. But entry number 9 stands out with a peculiarity that silenced the room. The entry describes a woman named Seraphine, aged 20, listed as an octoroon of exceptional breeding. But it is the addendum in red ink that draws the eye of the historian. The seller, a mysterious intermediary from Cincinnati, included a clause of sale stating that the vendor warrants purity of body but assumes no liability for the mortality of any who violate said purity. It was a warning that transformed a transaction into a macabre wager, suggesting that this specific human life carried a lethal defense mechanism. Witness testimonies from the diary of a visiting planter, Elias Thorne, described the atmosphere in the room as the bidding began. Thorne notes that Seraphine stood on the block, draped in heavy white linen, her face obscured by a veil that she refused to lift, creating an aura of sinister religious solemnity amidst the profane commerce. The auctioneer, usually a man of boisterous patter, spoke in hushed tones, reading the warning clause twice as if washing his hands of the consequences. The crowd, comprised of Richmond's elite and wealthy speculators from the Deep South, oscillated between nervous laughter and a heavy, predatory silence. They were men used to possessing whatever they desired, and the idea of a forbidden object only sharpened their appetites, turning the auction into a test of masculine bravado. Colonel Amos Drayton, a widower whose 3 plantations in Mississippi were rumored to be run with the efficiency of a penal colony, stood at the back of the room. Records indicate Drayton had traveled to Virginia specifically for this sale, having heard whispers of the untouchable beauty through his network of brokers. He was a man who had buried 2 wives and silenced countless rumors about his private life, known for a temperament that tolerated no resistance from man, beast, or nature. When the bidding stalled at an already exorbitant $4,000, fear seemingly overcoming lust in the room, Drayton stepped forward. His voice, described by Thorne as the sound of grinding stones, offered $7,200, a sum so staggering it effectively ended the contest. The gavel fell, echoing like a gunshot in the silent hall, and the ownership of Seraphine was transferred to Colonel Drayton. The transaction receipt, which would later become a key piece of evidence in the seizure of the Blackwood estate, shows Drayton's signature as a jagged, aggressive scrawl. He reportedly demanded the woman unveil herself immediately, but the auctioneer intervened, citing the specific terms of the transfer, which required the goods to be delivered, veiled to the transport carriage. Drayton laughed, a sound that Thorne described as chilling, and announced to his peers that he had purchased the ultimate challenge for his twilight years. He viewed the warning not as a threat, but as a marketing gimmick he intended to dismantle at his leisure. The journey from Richmond to the Mississippi Delta took 3 weeks, during which Seraphine was transported in a private carriage with the blinds drawn, accompanied only by a deaf-mute maid Drayton had hired for the purpose. The manifest of the steamboat River Queen, which carried them down the Ohio River, notes that the passengers in the private cabin never emerged for meals. The steward's log mentions a strange chemical scent lingering near their door, reminiscent of bitter almonds and stale flowers, which he attributed to female perfumes or medicines. This detail, overlooked at the time, serves as the first subtle indication that the science behind this mystery was already at play, hidden in plain sight within the claustrophobic confines of the luxury cabin. Upon arrival at Blackwood Manor, Drayton's ancestral estate isolated by miles of cypress swamp, the colonel made a decision that confused his staff. Instead of placing Seraphine in the slave quarters or even the servants' wing, he installed her in the Blue Room, a guest suite on the second floor of the main house. The plantation's overseer, Silas Cobb, wrote in his ledger that the colonel gave strict orders. "She is to be fed, clothed in white, and left entirely alone until I say otherwise." Drayton treated her less like a human being and more like a rare, poisonous orchid he had imported to admire from a distance before plucking. The dark secret of her presence began to permeate the psychology of the plantation almost immediately. The house slaves, attuned to the moods of the master and the subtle shifts in the household's energy, avoided the second-floor corridor. Cobb's ledger notes that the colonel seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the delay, boasting to visiting neighbors that he was letting the prize ripen and that he intended to claim his property on Christmas Eve, a date 6 months in the future. This self-imposed deadline created a palpable tension, a countdown that transformed the manor into a theater of waiting. The physical description of Seraphine during these early months comes only from fleeting glimpses. She was seen standing at the window looking north, always perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She spoke to no one, obeyed every command to sit or stand with fluid grace, and ate sparingly of the food brought to her door. Yet there was an intensity to her silence that unsettled the colonel's dogs. The hunting hounds, known for their aggression, would whine and cower whenever she passed through the garden, refusing to approach her. It was as if the animals sensed a biological threat that the humans were too arrogant to perceive. By the end of the first month, the novelty of the purchase had settled into a heavy, oppressive routine. Drayton went about his business with a strut of anticipation, while Seraphine existed as a ghost in his house, a constant reminder of the impossible warning he had purchased. The document that closes this era of the story is a letter from Drayton to his lawyer in Vicksburg, in which he jokes about the superstitions of the seller and confirms his updated will, ensuring that Seraphine is listed as property to be retained, never sold even after his death. He believed he owned her future. He could not have known she was already curating his end. The first crack in the reality of Blackwood Manor appeared in August 1852, recorded in the meticulous, if barely literate, daily logs of Silas Cobb, the overseer. Cobb was a man of practical violence, unbothered by the brutalities of plantation life, which makes his growing unease regarding the guest in the main house all the more significant. His entry for August 14th describes a peculiar incident involving the estate's pest control. The manor had been plagued by rats, common in the Delta, but Cobb noted that the rodent population had vanished entirely from the second floor, specifically from the wing where Seraphine resided. He found their small bodies lined up along the baseboards of the hallway, dead but unmarked, as if they had simply ceased to function in mid-scurry. Cobb attributed this to a bad air, or miasma, rising from the swamp, a common belief in the medical ignorance of the time. But he could not explain why the phenomenon was localized to the vicinity of the new arrival. He wrote of a coldness that seemed to radiate from her room, a drop in temperature that defied the oppressive Mississippi heat. When he reported this to Drayton, the colonel dismissed it as a failure of the cleaning staff to dispose of poisoned vermin, ignoring the fact that no poison had been laid. This refusal to acknowledge the anomaly established a pattern of denial that would seal the fate of the household. The atmosphere of the house began to shift from curiosity to dread. The kitchen staff, who prepared Seraphine's meals, reported that the food returned on the trays looked untouched, yet the woman did not emaciate. One maid, a woman named Clara, claimed in later oral histories recorded by the WPA projects of the 1930s that she saw Seraphine eating the air, sitting by the window and taking deep, rhythmic breaths as if sustenance came from the atmosphere itself. While scientifically impossible, this testimony points to the rigorous discipline Seraphine maintained, a control over her own biology that would later baffle the doctors who examined the case. The anomaly escalated when the plantation's livestock began to exhibit strange behaviors. Horses tethered near the main house would pull at their leads until their necks bled, desperate to distance themselves from the structure. Cobb's log details an incident where a prize stallion threw Drayton as they passed under Seraphine's window, the animal's eyes rolling back in terror at a scent carried on the breeze. Drayton, in a rage, shot the horse, blaming the animal's temperament rather than recognizing the biological alarm bells ringing around him. The violence of the act served only to deepen the silence of the house slaves, who now crossed themselves when mentioning the woman in white. In late August, a persistent fog settled over the estate, unusual for the season. It clung to the ground and seemed to seep into the floorboards of the manor. During this time, Cobb recorded that the mirrors in the hallway outside Seraphine's room tarnished overnight, the silver backing turning black as if exposed to a corrosive agent. The colonel's valet, a man named Thomas, was tasked with polishing them, but the tarnish returned within hours. This chemical reaction, dismissed as humidity damage, was a physical manifestation of the toxic presence slowly saturating the environment, a clue that the curse was elemental rather than spiritual. The first direct interaction between Cobb and Seraphine occurred on August 29th. Drayton ordered Cobb to inspect the window latches in the Blue Room to ensure they were secure against escape. Cobb entered the room while Seraphine sat in her usual chair. He wrote that the air in the room felt thin, making him lightheaded, and that a smell like crushed cherry pits hung heavy in the curtains. When he approached the window, Seraphine turned her head slowly and looked at him. Cobb described the sensation as having water poured into the lungs, a sudden, suffocating panic that forced him to flee the room. He vomited in the hallway immediately after. This physical reaction was the first documented biological effect on a human being at Blackwood Manor. Cobb, a man who prided himself on his toughness, refused to enter the main house for a week, conducting his meetings with Drayton on the veranda. He told the other overseers that there was something wrong with the air in that room, a statement that was both literally and metaphorically true. The science of the era lacked the vocabulary to describe what Cobb had experienced, leaving him to frame it in the language of hauntings and curses. Drayton's reaction to Cobb's fear was mockery. He viewed the overseer's reluctance as a weakness, a lack of fortitude that he, the master, did not possess. He began to spend more time near the blue room, pacing the hallway, taunting the silence behind the door. He would shout through the wood, reminding Seraphine of the date, December 24th, treating the growing dread of his staff as a game. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that his own body was likely already adapting, or failing to adapt, to the subtle environmental changes radiating from his prize. The month closed with a storm that battered the delta, shaking the foundations of the manor. During the height of the gale, the servants reported hearing a voice singing above the wind, a low, melodic chant coming from the blue room. It was not a song of mourning, but of preparation. Cobb noted in his final entry for August that the singing made his teeth ache and his heart flutter in his chest. The macabre reality was setting in. The house was no longer under the Colonel's control. It was becoming a vessel for something he had purchased, but could not comprehend. September brought the first human fatality, transforming the uneasy atmosphere into palpable terror. Julian Drayton, the Colonel's younger cousin from Savannah, arrived for a week-long visit, intending to secure a loan from his wealthy relative. Julian was a man of loose morals and heavy drinking habits, described in family letters as a wastrel with a wandering eye. He arrived unaware of the specific conditions of Seraphine's presence, viewing the rumors of the beautiful recluse as a challenge to his own charm. His letters to his wife in Georgia, later entered into evidence during the estate settlement, reveal his intent to sneak a peek at Amos's expensive statue while the Colonel was out riding. On September 12th, Julian made his attempt. The testimony of the housemaid Clara states that Julian waited until Drayton had left for the fields, then ascended the stairs with a bottle of wine, dismissing the servants with a slur. He was seen pounding on the door of the blue room, cajoling and threatening before picking the lock with a knife. The servants retreated to the kitchen, too terrified to intervene. The house fell silent for the better part of an hour. When Julian emerged, he looked pale and disoriented, stumbling down the stairs without his bottle. He told the valet he felt a sudden winter upstairs and retired to the guest room to sleep it off. Julian never woke up. He was found dead the next morning, his body rigid in the bed, eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling. The mystery of his death was immediate and baffling. There were no marks of violence, no signs of struggle, and no scent of alcohol on his breath, despite the bottle he had taken upstairs. The parish death registry recorded the cause as sudden apoplexy, a catch-all term for unexplained death, but the servants knew better. They whispered that he had breathed the air of the blue room and paid the price written in the contract. Drayton's reaction was a study in cognitive dissonance. Confronted with the fulfillment of the warning he had laughed at, he chose to double down on his denial. He loudly proclaimed that Julian had drunk himself to death, citing his cousin's history of excess. He forbade any mention of the curse and threatened to whip any slave caught gossiping about the incident. However, the Colonel's private behavior told a different story. He ordered the lock on Seraphine's door reinforced and stopped pacing the hallway at night, keeping a respectful distance from the room he claimed to own. The death of Julian triggered a subtle exodus of the local gentry. Invitations to Blackwood Manor were declined with polite excuses. The social calendar of the plantation emptied. The neighbors, sensing the dark cloud hanging over the estate, began to refer to the place as the tomb. This isolation served only to concentrate the tension within the house, leaving Drayton alone with his obsession and his fearful staff. The plantation became a closed system, a pressure cooker where the normal rules of society were suspended. 2 weeks after Julian's death, a second anomaly occurred involving the vegetation around the manor. The ivy that had climbed the west wall for decades, reaching up to the window of the blue room, withered and died within the span of 3 days. The leaves turned a sickly grey and crumbled to dust, leaving the brickwork exposed like bleached bone. The gardener, an enslaved man named Isaac, refused to clear the dead vines, claiming that the poison had seeped into the plant's veins. This botanical death provided visible, irrefutable evidence that the environment itself was reacting to the occupant of the room. During this period, Silas Cobb's journal entries became shorter and more erratic. He described waking up at night gasping for air, feeling a phantom weight on his chest. He began to sleep with his windows open, even in the chill of autumn, desperate for clean air. He noted that the birds had stopped singing in the oak trees nearest the house, creating a zone of silence that extended 50 yards from the porch. The natural world was retreating from Blackwood Manor, leaving a void that was being filled by fear. The most disturbing evidence, however, came from the laundry staff. The linens from Seraphine's room, collected weekly by the deaf-mute maid, were reported to have a strange texture, stiff and slightly oily to the touch. The washerwomen complained that the water used to clean them, turned a milky white, and killed the grass where it was dumped. They began to handle the sheets with sticks, refusing to let the fabric touch their bare skin. This tangible physical contamination was ignored by Drayton, who was too consumed by his own impending deadline to worry about the laundry. By the end of September, the pattern was undeniable. Death and decay were radiating from the blue room, affecting animals, plants, and humans alike. The accumulation of these anomalies created a picture of a threat that was not supernatural in the traditional sense, but biological, a contagion of science that was misunderstood as a curse. The stage was set for the next tragedy, as the household waited for the inevitable collision between the Colonel's arrogance and the lethal reality living under his roof. Dr. Eris Thorne, a physician trained in New Orleans and Paris, was summoned to Blackwood Manor in early October to examine the Colonel, who had been complaining of headaches and a metallic taste in his mouth. Thorne's medical log, a leather-bound volume rediscovered in a damp basement in 1952, provides the first analytical perspective on the horror unfolding at the estate. Thorne was a man of science, a skeptic of the Delta's superstitions, and his initial entries reflect a clinical detachment that would slowly erode over the coming weeks. Thorne's examination of Julian Drayton's body, conducted post-mortem at the family's request to rule out foul play, had puzzled him. He noted in his log that the corpse displayed a sweet rigidity in the facial muscles, unlike the rictus of a stroke or heart attack. The blood had settled oddly, remaining bright cherry red rather than darkening, a symptom Thorne associated with certain rare gas poisonings he had read about in European medical journals but had never seen in the American South. He could find no entry wound, no ingestion burns in the throat, and no needle marks. The cause of death remained a cipher. During his October visits, Thorne began to observe the Colonel's symptoms with growing alarm. Drayton displayed dilated pupils, a slight tremor in the hands, and an erratic, aggressive temperament that went beyond his usual tyranny. Thorne hypothesized that Drayton was suffering from nervous exhaustion or perhaps mild arsenic poisoning from a contaminated water source. He tested the plantation's wells, but found them pure. It was then that his attention turned to the guest he had heard whispered about in the servants' quarters. Thorne requested to examine Seraphine, ostensibly to check on her health as part of the household. Drayton initially refused, but eventually relented, driven by a flicker of concern that his prize might be ill. Thorne's account of entering the Blue Room is a masterclass in clinical horror. He describes the air as supernaturally still and carrying a faint, unrecognizable odor that made his eyes water. When he took Seraphine's pulse, he noted her skin was cool to the touch, and her heart rate was incredibly slow, barely 40 beats per minute, a state of hibernation, or extreme metabolic control. It was during this examination that Thorne formulated his first radical hypothesis. He noticed that Seraphine's breath, when she exhaled near his face while he checked her eyes, caused him a momentary wave of dizziness. He wrote in his log, "It is as if the subject is not merely living in the room, but altering its chemistry. Is it possible for a human organism to adapt to, or perhaps generate, a miasma that is toxic to others?" This question, written in 1852, touched upon concepts of toxicology that were decades ahead of their time. He suspected she was a carrier of some volatile agent, immune to it herself through long exposure. Thorne attempted to communicate this to Drayton, warning him that the air in the Blue Room was unfit for habitation and that Seraphine should be moved or quarantined. Drayton, paranoid and defensive, accused the doctor of trying to steal his property or frighten him out of his claim. "She is pure," Drayton insisted, slamming his fist on the desk. "The contract warranted purity. Purity cannot kill." He fired Thorne on the spot, banning him from the estate. Thorne did not leave the investigation there. His logs show that he began to correspond with chemists in the north, inquiring about odorless poisons that could be absorbed through the lungs. He referenced historical cases of toxicity and Eastern herbalism, trying to build a rational framework for the impossible. He became convinced that the curse was a sophisticated biological trap, a weaponized human being sent to Blackwood Manor for a specific purpose. The doctor's hypothesis represents the narrative's shift from a ghost story to a medical thriller. He realized that the danger was not a vengeful spirit, but a calculated application of chemistry. However, without access to the estate, he was powerless to stop the progression of events. He could only watch from a distance as the symptoms he had identified in the Colonel, the tremors, the paranoia, the sensory hallucinations, began to accelerate. Thorne's final entry regarding the case, written weeks before the climax, is a chilling prediction. "The Colonel is drinking from a poisoned cup every time he breathes the air in that house," he wrote. "The mechanism of death is invisible, silent, and absolute. Science may explain it one day, but by then there will be no one left to hear the diagnosis." This hypothesis, buried in a private journal, would be the closest anyone came to saving Amos Drayton from himself. November 1852 marked the complete collapse of the social order within Blackwood Manor. The incident that shattered the remaining discipline of the household was the death of the Colonel's trusted valet, Thomas. Thomas had been with the family for 30 years, a man who knew every secret of the Drayton lineage and had served faithfully through 2 generations. His death was not merely a loss of labor. It was the severance of the last bond between the master and his people. The incident occurred on a Tuesday evening. Thomas had been sent upstairs to deliver a pitcher of water to the hallway outside the Blue Room. According to the cook, Thomas had been boasting earlier that day that he wasn't afraid of no white witch and that he intended to get a look at the woman who had the master so bedeviled. He was found an hour later, collapsed in the corridor, the pitcher shattered on the floor. His body was twisted in a spasm of agony, his hands clutching his throat as if trying to tear it open to let in air. The macabre nature of his death, occurring in the open hallway rather than inside the room, sent a shockwave of terror through the enslaved population of the estate. It suggested that the sphere of death was expanding, leaking out from behind the locked door. The house slaves, who had endured the Colonel's cruelty for years, finally reached a breaking point. That night, 7 of the 12 house servants fled into the swamp, choosing the treacherous uncertainty of the bayou over the certain doom of the manor. Drayton's reaction was explosive. He organized a hunting party to retrieve the runaways, but the dogs, usually eager for the chase, refused to track. They whined and circled, confused by the scent of death that now permeated the clothes of everyone who lived in the main house. The hunt was a failure. Drayton returned to an empty house, forced to boil his own water and saddle his own horse. The hierarchy of the plantation had dissolved, leaving him the king of a deserted castle. The social fracture extended beyond the estate's borders. The town of Vicksburg, usually indifferent to the private affairs of planters, began to treat Blackwood Manor as a quarantine zone. Supplies ordered from town were left at the main gate. Delivery boys refused to ride up the oak-lined avenue. The local priest, Father O'Malley, rode out to offer a blessing for the house, but was turned away by Drayton, who stood on the porch with a shotgun, shouting that he needed no Romish mumbling to handle his affairs. Drayton's isolation became absolute. He stopped attending the parish council meetings and ceased his weekly trips to the cotton exchange. Letters from his business partners went unanswered. He was consuming himself in the vacuum he had created, his entire existence narrowing down to the geography of the second floor. The records from the local general store show that his orders changed: crates of brandy, candles and ammunition, the supplies of a man preparing for a siege. The few servants who remained, mostly elderly or too fearful to run, described a change in the colonel's appearance. He stopped shaving, his clothes went unwashed, and he began to talk to himself, holding loud, one-sided arguments with the silence of the house. He was heard bargaining with the heir, offering money, freedom and power in exchange for submission. It was the behavior of a man whose mind was cracking under the pressure of the sinister ambiguity he lived with. This period of social collapse is crucial because it stripped Drayton of all external checks and balances. There was no one left to tell him no, no one to warn him, no one to intervene. He was alone with the object of his obsession. The most beautiful slave had effectively sieged the plantation without lifting a finger, using the fear she generated to strip away the colonel's power structure layer by layer. By the end of November, Blackwood Manor was effectively a ghost ship drifting toward a reef. The lights burned all night in the library, where Drayton sat drinking, waiting for the calendar to turn. The social fracture was complete. The moral fracture was imminent. The world had turned its back on Amos Drayton, leaving him to the mercy of the macabre justice waiting upstairs. December arrived with a biting frost that killed the last of the garden's roses, mirroring the final decay of Colonel Drayton's sanity. The primary source for this period is Drayton's own personal journal, a leather-bound volume found on his desk after his death. The handwriting, initially the sharp, confident script of a man of business, degrades over the entries of December into a jagged, frantic scrawl, documenting the disintegration of a mind under siege by unknown forces. The entry for December 5th records the onset of auditory hallucinations. "I hear her singing," Drayton wrote, the ink blotted with spilled brandy. "Not the hymns of the field hands, nor the operas of the French. It is a low, humming vibration that rattles the teeth in my skull. It comes through the floorboards, it comes through the walls. When I open the door, silence. Absolute, mocking silence. She sits there like a statue of ice, but I know she is the source. She is singing my death song." By December 12th, the journal reveals Drayton's obsession with the concept of contamination. He describes burning his clothes after walking past her door, convinced they smelled of the sweet rot that pervaded the hallway. Yet paradoxically, this fear only heightened his resolve. "I will break this," he wrote. "I will not be defeated by a perfume. It is a trick of the mind. A woman is flesh and blood. Flesh can be owned. Blood can be spilled. I have paid for the right to conquer this fear." The entry reveals the core of his tragedy, his refusal to accept that there are things his money cannot domesticate. The impact of this psychological unraveling was visible in his physical actions. The few remaining field hands reported seeing the colonel standing in the yard at midnight, staring up at the blue room window, screaming challenges at the dark glass. He fired his pistol into the air, demanding that she show herself, but the window remained dark and still. The terrifying contrast between his rage and her impassive silence created a dynamic of predator and prey, where the roles were increasingly reversed. On December 18th, a significant entry details a moment of near clarity. Drayton admits to feeling a cold hand squeezing the heart whenever he dwells on the impending date of Christmas Eve. Perhaps the warning was true, he scribbles. Perhaps death is the price of the prize. But what is life if a man cannot claim what is his? I would rather die a master than live a coward. This fatalistic logic cemented his path. He viewed survival without conquest as a form of emasculation. The journal also records his systematic preparation for the end. He drafted a new will, though it was incoherent in places, leaving the plantation to the silence. He listed the specific bottle of brandy he intended to open, a rare French vintage saved for special victories. He treated the approaching date not as a sexual conquest, but as a military operation, a breach of a fortress. The language he used was violent, tactical, and desperate. A particularly chilling entry from December 20th describes a dream. I dreamt the room was filled with water, he wrote. I entered and could not breathe, but she was swimming in the air, smiling. She breathed the water as if it were wind. I drowned at her feet and she did not blink. And this nightmare reflects his subconscious awareness of the respiratory nature of the threat, the science of the poison manifesting in his sleeping mind as drowning. The evidence of his decline is irrefutable. The man who wrote the final entries was not the confident colonel who bid at the auction. He was a haunted shell, driven by a compulsion he could no longer control. He had convinced himself that breaking the curse was the only way to restore his sanity, unaware that the attempt would be the final nail in his coffin. The final entry, dated December 23rd, is a single line, written with a steady hand that contrasts with the previous chaos. Tomorrow the silence ends. I will open the door and I will take the breath from her lungs. It was a promise and a prophecy, though not in the way he intended. The document stands as the final testament of a man walking willingly into a gas chamber of his own making. The morning of December 24th, 1852, broke gray and heavy over the Mississippi Delta. The atmosphere at Blackwood Manor was one of finality. Colonel Drayton issued what he called his General Order, a directive that formally dissolved the remaining household operations for the night. He summoned Silas Cobb to the veranda, Cobb having refused to step inside, and gave instructions that no living soul was to remain within the perimeter fence of the main house after sunset. "You are to take the remaining staff to the quarters," Drayton commanded, his voice described by Cobb as hollow but steady. "Lock the main gates from the outside. No one enters, no one leaves until I signal from the balcony tomorrow morning. If you hear sounds, you ignore them. If you hear screaming, you ignore it. This is my house, and tonight I am the law." It was the ultimate assertion of authority, a man creating a sealed arena for his confrontation. By 4 p.m. the house was empty. The cook, the maids, and the valet's replacement had all retreated to the distant slave cabins, carrying their fear with them. The manor stood silent, a hulking silhouette against the darkening sky. Drayton was alone inside, the master of a kingdom of dust and shadows. He was seen by the departing staff locking the heavy oak front doors, sliding the iron bolts home with a finality that echoed across the lawn. The weather turned violent as night fell. A winter storm, rare for its intensity, swept up from the Gulf, battering the house with rain and wind. The thunder drowned out any sounds that might have come from within. To the observers huddling in the cabins, the storm felt like a manifestation of the sinister energy building inside the manor. The physical world was reacting to the moral transgression about to take place. Inside, the timeline is reconstructed from the position of objects found later. Drayton spent the early evening in the library. A half-empty decanter of whiskey and a loaded pistol were found on the desk, alongside the key to the blue room, which he had kept on a chain around his neck. He was steeling himself, drinking not for pleasure, but for courage. The fire in the grate had burned down to ash, suggesting he sat in the cold for hours, contemplating the stairs. At 10 p.m., a flash of lightning illuminated the house for the watchers outside. Cobb reported seeing a single light moving up the staircase window, a candelabra carried by the colonel. The light paused on the landing, then moved down the hallway toward the north wing. Then the light disappeared. Drayton had reached the threshold. The collapse of his authority over his own fear was complete. He was now operating on pure destructive instinct. The significance of this moment lies in the total isolation. Drayton had removed every witness, every potential aid, every barrier. He had engineered the perfect conditions for the locked room mystery that would baffle the authorities. He believed he was securing his privacy. In reality, he was sealing the test chamber for Seraphine's chemistry. The storm raged until just before dawn, masking the climax of the night. No screams were heard, no gunshots rang out. The violence, whatever it was silent. The authority of the colonel, built on noise and force, was swallowed by the absolute quiet of the blue room. When the sun rose on Christmas morning, the house stood undamaged, the front door still bolted. But no signal came from the balcony. The general order had been obeyed, but the counter-order never came. The silence that drifted down from the manor was heavier than the storm. The authority of Amos Drayton had not just collapsed, it had been extinguished. The pivotal revelation that transforms this story from a supernatural tale to a historical crime thriller comes from a source that Amos Drayton never saw. In the chaotic aftermath of the estate's seizure, a pile of unopened mail was discovered in the colonel's study, buried under unpaid bills and legal threats. Among them was a letter postmarked from Cincinnati, Ohio, dated November 1852. It had been intercepted by the incompetence of the postal service and the chaos of the household, arriving too late to be read. The letter was addressed not to Drayton, but to Agent S. The envelope was thick, sealed with plain wax. The sender was listed only as the Society of Friends, a known cover for abolitionist networks. The contents, analyzed by the magistrate's office, provided the missing key to the enigma of Seraphine. It was not a love letter or a rescue plan. It was a technical manual. The volatile essence has been shipped separately, the letter read, written in a precise, educated hand. Remember the training. 1 vial daily to maintain immunity. The second vial is to be unstoppered only in the confined space. Do not breathe deeply until the glass is broken. The vapor is heavier than air and will settle. Wait for the subject to enter. The reaction is immediate upon inhalation by the uninoculated. This document shattered the curse narrative. It revealed that Seraphine was not a passive victim or a supernatural entity. She was an assassin, a soldier deployed behind enemy lines with a biological weapon. The essence described fits the profile of a concentrated cyanide compound or a similar volatile toxin suspended in a solution that allowed for rapid evaporation. The science of the 19th century was being weaponized by the abolitionist underground to strike at the untouchable elite. The letter also contained a personal note at the bottom. Your mother's debt is paid with this act. The monster who hunted her will be hunted by her own blood. Be the angel of death he fears. God is with you. This revealed the personal motive. Seraphine was not a random slave. She was family. The monster was her uncle. The mission was not just liberation. It was execution. The discovery of this source recontextualized every anomaly. The coldness of the room was likely the result of keeping the temperature low to prevent premature evaporation of the chemicals. The death of the rats and the ivy was collateral damage from minor leaks. The sweet rigidity of Cousin Julian's face was the classic rictus of cyanide poisoning. Seraphine had been slowly saturating her environment, building her own immunity while turning her prison into a gas chamber. The Society of Friends had exploited the Colonel's own arrogance. They knew he would buy the most beautiful woman. They knew he would isolate her. They knew he would wait. Every psychological weakness of Amos Drayton had been factored into the assassination plot. The letter was the blueprint for the perfect crime, relying on the victim's vices to ensure its success. This hidden source serves as the bridge between the macabre folklore and the cold reality of justice. It proves that the horror at Blackwood Manor was not a haunting, but a covert operation. A young woman, armed only with chemistry and patience, had invaded the fortress of a tyrant and waited for him to come to her. The letter ends with a final instruction. Burn this after reading. Because it was never read, and thus never burned, it survived to tell the true story. It stands as a testament to the sophistication of the resistance, proving that while the masters had the whips, the oppressed had the science. The narrative now reconstructs the final hours of Christmas Eve, based on the forensic evidence found in the Blue Room and the psychological profile established by the journals. At 11:45 p.m., Colonel Drayton made his move. The source for his mindset is the unfinished note found on the hallway table outside the door, likely placed there in a moment of drunken bravado. It read, "To the silence, I am coming in." Drayton unlocked the door. The mechanism, rusty from disuse, required force. The scratches found on the brass keyhole plate indicate his hands were shaking. He pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the fireplace and the flash of the storm outside. He stepped across the threshold, carrying the bottle of brandy and a riding crop, symbols of his intended domination. Inside the room, the trap was already sprung. Seraphine had unstoppered the vials. The air was thick with the colorless, odorless vapor described in the Cincinnati letter. To a normal person, the room would have felt suffocating, but Drayton, adrenaline coursing through his veins, ignored the warning signs of his own body. He closed the door behind him and locked it from the inside, sealing his own fate. He believed he was trapping her. In reality, he was locking himself in the chamber. The forensic reconstruction suggests he advanced toward the chair by the window where Seraphine sat. He likely spoke, perhaps shouting his triumph, inhaling deeply of the toxic air. The decision for decisive action he had recorded in his journal, to take the breath from her, became a gruesome irony. With every shout, every heavy breath of exertion, he accelerated the poison's uptake into his bloodstream. Seraphine's role in these final moments was one of terrifying passivity. She did not fight. She did not scream. She simply sat, breathing shallowly, her body inoculated against the agent that was killing him. She watched as the confusion set in. Drayton would have felt the dizziness first, then the tightness in the chest, the water in the lungs that Cobb had described. The scratches found on the inside of the door tell the end of the story. Drayton realized too late that the danger was real. He turned back, dropping the brandy bottle, which shattered on the rug. He clawed at the wood, trying to turn the key, but his motor functions were failing. The paralysis, the sweet rigidity, was taking hold. He slumped against the door, sliding down to the floor, his eyes fixed on the woman in white who watched him die. It was a slow, quiet execution. The most beautiful slave had become the judge, jury, and executioner. Drayton's decision to act, justified by his arrogance and his need for control, had led him directly into the one scenario he could not fight. You cannot whip a gas. You cannot shoot a chemical reaction. He died grasping for power, stripped of it by the very air he breathed. The source of his justification, his belief in his ownership, was the instrument of his downfall. He claimed he wanted to possess her breath. In the end, he shared it, and it killed him. The silence of the room returned, broken only by the storm outside, as the colonel's heart stuttered and stopped. The magistrate's report, filed on December 26, 1852, by Thaddeus Roth of Vicksburg, is the definitive document of the aftermath. Roth arrived at Blackwood Manor at noon on Christmas Day, summoned by Silas Cobb, who had finally dared to break down the front door. The report describes the scene with clinical yet horrified precision. The blue room door had to be forced open with axes. Roth noted that the body of Colonel Drayton lay blocking the threshold. His face was twisted in a rictus of shock, eyes wide and unseeing. There was no blood, no weapon, no sign of physical struggle. The room smelled faintly of almonds. Sitting by the window, bathed in the cold light of the winter morning, was Seraphine. She was composing a letter on the colonel's own stationery. Roth's interrogation of Seraphine is the climax of the documentary narrative. For 6 months she had been silent. Now she spoke. Roth recorded her words verbatim, noting her calm, educated diction, which contrasted sharply with her status as a slave. When asked if she had killed the colonel, she replied, "He sought to steal my breath. I simply let him have it." She then revealed her identity. She was born Sarah Drayton, free in Ohio, the daughter of Drayton's estranged sister who had fled the South decades earlier. She had not been captured. She had volunteered. She had used the slave markets as a Trojan horse to reach the man who had tormented her mother. The curse was a fabrication to ensure he bought her. The silence was a necessity of the mission. The poison was justice. Roth was paralyzed. He had a dead white man, a confessed black woman, and absolutely no murder weapon. The poison had dissipated into the air. There was no gun, no knife, no bruise. Legally, she had done nothing but sit in a room while a man died of natural causes. To charge her with murder would require admitting that a black woman had outsmarted a white colonel with superior science, a precedent the Southern court was terrified to set. The interpretation of the scene was a legal nightmare. If they executed her, they made her a martyr and admitted the vulnerability of the master class. If they freed her, they admitted that the law was powerless against such intelligence. Seraphine handed Roth the receipt for $7,200, the price Drayton had paid. "I have purchased myself with his life," she said. "The debt is cancelled." Roth's report concludes with a recommendation that borders on superstition. "This woman is dangerous in a way the law cannot define," he wrote. "To keep her is to invite further calamity. To hang her is to invite insurrection. I recommend the court wash its hands of the matter. It was an admission of defeat. The institution of slavery, confronted with a being who refused to play by its rules, crumbled. The document ends with the coroner's verdict, visitation of God. It was a lie to cover a truth too uncomfortable to print. Drayton had not been visited by God. He had been visited by the consequences of his own sins, delivered in a glass vial. The legal fallout was swift and absolute. The court, terrified of Seraphine's presence, granted her manumission papers on December 27th, citing meritorious service in a perverse twist of legal language to expedite her removal from the state. She was given 24 hours to leave Mississippi. The estate of Blackwood Manor was seized by the bank to cover the debts Drayton had incurred, including the massive sum he had paid for his own assassin. Seraphine walked out of the Vicksburg courthouse, a free woman. Witnesses described her wearing a black dress she had sewn herself, walking with head high, carrying nothing but the manumission papers and the receipt of sale. She boarded a steamboat northbound that same afternoon. She did not look back. The most beautiful slave had dismantled a dynasty and walked away with the receipt in her pocket. Blackwood Manor fell into immediate ruin. No one would buy it. The locals believed the poison air still lingered. The fields went fallow. The house was reclaimed by the swamp. In 1863, during the Civil War, Union troops camped on the grounds burned the main house to the ground, claiming it was evil. The fire was reportedly a strange green color, fueling further legends. The legacy of the case rippled through the legal system. For years, auction houses in the South refused to handle slaves with warning clauses, fearing another Trojan horse. The Drayton case became a hushed cautionary tale among planters, a reminder that the people they owned were watching, thinking, and planning. Records from Paris in the 1870s mention a wealthy patron of the arts, a woman of mixed race known as Madame Sarah, who funded hospitals and chemistry laboratories, while never definitively linked, the timeline and description match. It suggests that Seraphine lived a long, full life, using the freedom she had engineered to advance the very science that had liberated her. The consequences were clear. Drayton was dead, his line extinguished. Seraphine was free, her legacy alive. The moral arc of the universe had bent toward justice, but it had required a steady hand and a closed room to do so. The ruins of Blackwood Manor are gone now, reclaimed by the Mississippi mud, but the story of the touch her and die curse remains a potent piece of Delta folklore. Historians analyze the case not as a ghost story, but as an early instance of asymmetric warfare. It challenges the narrative of the passive victim, presenting instead a protagonist who turned the tools of her oppression, her beauty, her silence, her value, into weapons. Was it justice? The law said no, but the outcome said yes. Seraphine proved that the system of slavery was built on a fragility, the assumption that the enslaved would not use the master's arrogance against him. Drayton died because he could not conceive of a black woman as an intellectual equal, let alone a superior strategist. His racism was the blind spot that allowed the poison to enter the room. We are left with the image of the open door. The bedroom where the colonel died was never locked again. It stood open to the wind and the rain until the fire took it. It serves as a symbol of the truth that cannot be contained. You can lock the gates, you can silence the servants, you can buy the warnings, but you cannot shut out the consequences of your actions. As we look back at the macabre mystery of 1852, we must ask ourselves, how many other curses in history were simply the misunderstood resistance of the silenced? How many ghosts were actually scientists, soldiers, and mothers fighting for their lives? And if we listen closely to the wind blowing through the Delta cypress trees, can we still hear the silence of Seraphine waiting for the moment to strike? Some say that if you stand on the spot where the manor once stood and hold your breath, you can feel the air grow cold and smell the faint scent of almonds. They say it is the colonel, still gasping for air. But perhaps it is just the memory of a justice so cold it froze time itself. This story reminds us that the most terrifying secrets are not supernatural but human. If you felt the chill of the Blue Room tonight, you are one of us. Join our community of investigators by clicking the subscribe button for Before the Story. We release new documentaries every week that challenge what you think you know about history. And before you go, I have one question for you to answer in the comments. If you had been in the colonel's place, would you have heeded the warning, or would your curiosity have been your death sentence?